Okay, today we're going to talk about reducing dimension using principal components analysis, or PCA. So PCA is a widely studied method, and there are actually multiple ways of deriving it. But we're not going to go through any of them. But we will work a few examples that I think should help out. In fact, I spent the last hour and a half looking for easy ways to describe this, and frankly, I'm just worried we'd get lost in the weeds. So the idea is that we have maybe data in 3 dimensions, as shown here on the left, and right now, depending on how you look at it, that data may overlap. But if we look at it from the correct perspective, orthogonal to this plane that's drawn there, you can see that the data does indeed fall into separate clusters. So principal components analysis is one way of trying to take data in a higher dimension and express it in a lower dimension in such a way that you have maximal separation between the data samples. So there's one example. I will show you one other one in MATLAB. So in MATLAB here, I have created an example. It generates 1,000 samples of 2-dimensional data using rand_n. Then it transforms that data using a matrix A, which is 10, 1, 2, -1, and it shows us the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of that matrix, which will be important in a minute. So it transforms that in the next line, and then finally it plots the data as a scatter plot. So let's run this and see where it comes to so far. There we are. Now the green lines are added down below, and I haven't discussed those yet, but I will momentarily. So what would have been 2-dimensional data would have, rand_n would have shown up as a small round cluster of data. Because I transformed it with this matrix A, it has now stretched it all out. And in fact, it's pretty easy to see that it stretched it in the direction of this long green vector right here, in both directions. This short green vector is showing the direction essentially that's orthogonal to the long green one. So where does that come in? Well, what we plotted here was that long green vector is the first eigenvalue of A, or eigenvector of A, scaled by the first eigenvalue of A. And then the shorter one is the second eigenvector scaled by the second eigenvalue of A. And there we go. Okay, so why is this interesting? Let's go back and look at that plot. It may be, in fact, let's just copy that. It may be that we just have one particular type of data. It varies along one dimension, but when we observe it, there's a bunch of noise. Well, the noise is going to perhaps affect both dimensions, but it would account for this spread that we have, this vertical, or almost vertical spread. And the dimension of interest might be along here. So the ideal thing to do would be to just project all of the values down to this line, where we could look at our data along a single dimension. I'll explain why more as we go. But the big question is, how do we find the correct line to project to? It does not quite line up with the x-axis, which should be like this. And in fact, we have no guarantee it will line up with any axis, and it could be at any rotation. So we want to find that line. Now, you might have already spotted it. This eigenvector is actually the span of that vector defines this projection line that we care about. No coincidence I used green for both of them. The trick then is to find this eigenvector. Well, all we have is the data. We don't have the original projection matrix. So we have to come up with some way of getting to that data, or getting to that line. If we're dealing with a plane, or 3 dimensions, and we're projecting it down to 2 dimensions, we now are dealing with a plane where the plane is defined by the span of 2 vectors as shown there. So we need to find those 2 vectors that define our plane. Okay, so enter principal components analysis. Start by saying, or coming up with a bunch of samples. We'll have it in n dimensions. In other words, xi is an n by 1 vector. So that vector would hold whatever features of the signal that we care about, whether it's the energy, or a measure of peak prominence, or maybe all 16 or 64 or 1024 samples of the spectrum magnitude of the signal. And let xi, so these are vectors here, we're not dealing with signals. I'll try to make them bold to make that a little bit more obvious. Be the averages. In other words, x bar is equal to 1 over n, I equals 1 to n of these vectors xi. So you could also write that, if it helps to be a little bit more clear, goes 1 to n of xi1, xi2 to xi capital N, where n is the dimension of the vector. Okay, so now we will define a matrix as x is equal to x1 minus x bar. That's the first column. The second column is x2 minus x bar, and so on and so forth, up to the last sample, xn minus x bar. In other words, this matrix is made up of the samples after we've removed the mean. So next, let Q equal x transpose. I made a mistake. Up above, x, the matrix, is capital N by little n. But when we do x transpose, we get an n by n capital N by capital N matrix. And note that Q is square, being n by n. Q is symmetric, and let's look at the individual samples here. We have the mean removed x1 times x1 on the diagonal, and then that row continues with x1 times x2, x1 times x3, and so on and so forth. So we call this, if we were finding the expectation, this would be a covariance matrix. So it's sometimes called a scatter matrix, and sometimes called a covariance matrix. So scatter matrix maybe doesn't help much, also called the covariance matrix. Now it's important to remember that this is not covariance in the way that we've talked about with respect to expectations. We're not taking a expectation of anything, and we're not even averaging. So it's not properly a covariance matrix, but it has a lot of the same structure as one, and so it's called that. It could be large. If n is, say all the samples in a spectrum, this could be very large. This is the theorem. Each vector xj can be written as x bar, the sum of all the previous ones. So we are going to go through and sum up actually each of the eigenvectors of Q in linear combination to create our estimate of every sample. So in practice, it's very, very rare to have anything with real signals have zero eigenvalues. For that to be the case, you would have to have a noise-free duplication of some feature someplace. So, but we put that in there just because it is necessary for completeness. Okay, so let's consider this. First off, if we have all these non-zero eigenvectors, and Q is n by n, and the dimension of x is n, we're talking capital N, I maybe should have used another variable, then it would be clear that these eigenvalues or eigenvectors of a square symmetric matrix would span the full n-dimensional space. And so it would make sense that we could write any vector in that space as a linear combination of those. So that's not a surprise, but it's what we do with those that really matters. So in essence then, these g values would be coordinates in the eigenvector space. These will be orthonormal. One of the properties of starting with a square symmetric matrix is that we can find orthonormal eigenvectors that would span the space like this. Okay, well, if this is the case, let's go back and look at that plot that we had at the beginning. It's in right here. In this case, we had two eigenvectors, both indicated in green. Then we see the one associated with the larger eigenvector, it's scaled by the eigenvector, and that's how we can tell it's the larger one, goes along the principal axis of that data. The other one is orthogonal to it. Well, if we wanted to approximate this data, we could approximate it as the span of the larger eigenvector and ignore the contribution of the smaller one. What would that do? It would flatten it so that it was now all laid along a single line that was the span of the larger eigenvector. Well, so we can approximate xj as xj, well, let's put it in here as an approximation. Approximately equals the mean plus I equals 1. I'm going to put p up here Everything else is the same. It's just that P is less than N. In other words, we can just use some of the eigenvectors to approximate our data. In many cases, many of the eigenvalues are small, usually those associated just with noise spread, while a few eigenvectors are very large. And in this case, by the way, we must assume that assume the eigenvectors are sorted so that lambda 1 is greater than or equal to lambda 2. By doing this, we can take data that is very high dimensional and get rid of the dimensions that don't matter as much and give us now a effectively lower dimensional approximation. So the lower dimensional feature vector for xj would be g j1 up to g jp. So PCA is one way that we can take something like maybe a whole spectrum where nearby values of the spectrum may actually be similar because the spectrum is smooth or has some sort of structure, and expressing that in far fewer dimensions where the contribution of each of the dimensions is now independent of the others and provides new and useful information. So applying PCA to a large dimensional feature vector is a way of getting something that works better in classification, requiring fewer training samples, and that gets at the heart of the variance and the variation in the data.